things, and so I'm going to go ahead. I'm Amy Drew Stanley from the University of Chicago. I also want to note that I am the student of David Bryan Davis, whose name I think belongs here. His spirit and ideas haunt us. As to footnote Michael Johnson, he once talked about Davis's scholarship that we're all actually doing the problem of slavery and anti-slavery in the age of David Bryan Davis. So I just wanted to invoke his presence here. Okay, we have three wonderful papers, wonderful panelists. Our first presenter is Corey Brooks. Corey is an assistant professor at York College of Pennsylvania. His current book project is entitled Liberty Power, Anti-Slavery Third Parties and the Transformation of American Politics. It's forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. Brooks is also the co-editor of a 2007 book, Their Patriotic Duty, which looks at the Civil War correspondence between a Union soldier in the U.S. colored troops and his family in Ohio. And he's also the author of an op-ed with the intriguing title of, quote, Obama's evolving position on same-sex marriage is similar to Lincoln's evolution on anti-slavery, which appeared in several newspapers in 2012. Our next presenter is Joe Murphy, who we say many thanks to. Also, I neglected to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to the organizer of the concert. Thank you to CUNY. Thank you to the paper givers, whatever. Okay, so thank you to Joe. Okay, so Joe is a PhD candidate at CUNY, and he's currently finishing his dissertation, which is entitled No More Power, Salmon P. Chase and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Platform on the Origins of the Anti-Slavery Constitutional Program adopted by the Liberty, Free Soil, and Republican parties. He's taught at Hunter and at John Jay, and he served as an assistant for the Gotham Center for New York City History. He's currently at work on an article about the pre-Civil War debates on slavery's constitutional status on the high seas. Our last presenter is Caleb McDaniel. He is an assistant professor of history at Rice. He's the author of the multiple prize-winning 2013 book entitled The Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery, Garrisonian Abolitionists, and Transatlantic Reform, among other things that received the Curdy Award for the best book in American intellectual history. In that book, McDaniel offered a transnational analysis of abolitionism, revealing the links between American radicals and European theorists of democratic politics. He's currently at work on a new project on refugee slaves and resilient slaveholders in the Trans-Mississippi during and immediately after the Civil War.
So let me echo the many thanks that have been given to Jim and John and to the various institutions, including CUNY, that made this possible. And thanks to Amy for the introduction, and thanks also to all of my co-panelists today for making this such a rich discussion that started yesterday and will continue all day, and I suspect for many months and perhaps years going forward. My paper is entitled The Slave Power Argument and Abolitionist Partisan Politics. In the summer of 1848, a month before the Abolitionist Liberty Party merged into the more moderate Free Soil Party, Joshua Leavitt exclaimed to fellow Liberty Party manager Salmon Chase, quote, "The slave power is now indissolubly incorporated in the political nomenclature of this country. We must make the most of that word. It is not necessary that they who use it should ever know who taught it to them. The incessant use of the term will do much to open the eyes and arouse the energies of the people. We must rescue the government from the control of the slave power, as slavery has evidently fastened its death grasp upon the political institutions of the country. We shall doubtless be compelled to pursue this controversy until slavery itself shall be no more." Once the issue of slavery's extension into territory conquered from Mexico intruded on the second party system, condemnations of the Southern slave power multiplied across the North with stunning rapidity. Leavitt and Chase clearly understood that it was Liberty Party political abolitionists like themselves who had taught, to quote Leavitt, more mainstream Northern politicians to use this powerful rhetorical tool to explain and to combat Southern influence over federal policymaking. From the late 1830s through the onset of the Civil War, abolitionist activists insisted that overthrowing the slave power represented the first step on the road to eradicating American slavery. Abolitionists' role in pioneering this slave power idea, however, has been consistently underemphasized or misconstrued. And such hazy understandings of the slave power argument have also helped shroud the story of the most influential third-party movement in American political history. Working first through the Liberty Party and later through the more moderate Free Soil and Republican parties, political abolitionists emphasized a slave power argument that represented the most promising approach for advancing anti-slavery politics. Because of its multiple valences, historians have often emphasized the versions of this anti-slavery rhetoric that seem most disconnected from the abolitionist moral crusade. Typical are works attributing the concept's popularity primarily to either a Jacksonian small producer ethos or paranoid fears of outlandish conspiracies against the Republic. Conventional interpretations have thereby downplayed the core of abolitionist anti-slave power politics and have consequently also overlooked political abolitionists' success in marshaling their slave power analysis to reorient national political debate. For its political abolitionist progenitors, the slave power argument represented more than just a clever rhetorical move. Abolitionist anti-slave power appeal encompassed a studied institutional critique of the second-party system of Whigs and Democrats. With both major parties reliant on slaveholding support to win national contests for control of Congress and the presidency, abolitionists charged that even the most outspoken anti-slavery Whig and Democratic politicians remain structurally beholden to the slave power. This diagnosis of the slave power's sway over the party system convinced abolitionists of the need for third-party political action, and then became the Liberty parties and later the Free Soil parties' most pervasive, and perhaps most persuasive, and compelling line of argument. To fully understand the origins of the American Civil War, we must appreciate, first, the partisan dimensions of political abolitionist slave power argument, along with their consistent and ultimately successful pursuit of a victorious Northern-dominated party as a precondition for anti-slavery policymaking. As abolitionists embarked on efforts to promote their policy agenda of combating slavery everywhere under federal jurisdiction, which Jim Oakes has discussed at length and which Joe Murphy will elaborate upon shortly, as they embarked on efforts to promote that policy agenda, they encountered fierce resistance, which they consistently turned to their own benefit. As they responded to the assault on Northern civil liberties, epitomized especially by the congressional gag rule on anti-slavery petitions, abolitionists elaborated an increasingly forceful condemnation of pro-slavery political power. As early as 1837, abolitionists characterized pro-slavery congressional forces as an ominous slave-holding power in the national councils. In 1838, Michigan abolitionist Seymour Treadwell's American Liberties and American Slavery repeatedly assailed this slave-holding power that was insidiously but rapidly undermining all our institutions. There could, Treadwell averred, be no alternative to degrading vassalage to the slave-holding power of the South as long as slavery shall continue. In 1839, abolitionist jurist William Jayes, A View of the Action of the Federal Government, offered a similarly thorough expose of slaveholders' disproportionate sway. The slave power in Congress, Jay demonstrated, had consistently controlled federal policy with the aid of inflated representation it received for 3/5 of slaves. Equally culpable Northern politicians, Jay criticized, facilitated Southern domination by consistently submitting to pro-slavery demands. Politically minded abolitionists were thus elated when Ohio Democratic Senator Thomas Morris broadcast similar sentiments, also in 1839. Serving out his lame duck term after being discarded by fellow Democrats in Columbus, Morris warned that the slave power commanded the whole power of the country and both political parties. While Morris's speech did at points link the slave power of the South and banking power of the North, scholarship emphasizing democratic anti-slavery impulses has tended to overstate both the novelty and Jacksonian origins of Morris's anti-slave power arguments. Morris was not the first to use the phrase or the concept of the slave power, but his Senate oration vastly widened its reach, and political abolitionists soon seized on the term as a pithy, potent shorthand for the more complex analyses that abolitionists like Treadwell and Jay had been honing for years. In observing the next two national elections, for Speaker of the House in December of 1839 and for President in 1840, abolitionists saw confirmation of their increasingly vocal warnings that membership in either major party necessarily entailed deference to the slave power. The 1839 speakership contest demonstrated how little abolitionists could expect from Democratic or Whig partisans, even the putatively anti-slavery Whigs of the Upper North. In this contest, a bloc of hardcore pro-slavery states' rights men rejected both major party caucus nominees, who were incidentally both slaveholders but were insufficiently committed to the defense of slavery by the states' rights men's perception. And thereby, this states' rights bloc stalemated the choice for speaker through 10 inconclusive ballots. When a subset of these pro-slavery holdouts offered to cooperate with mainstream Whigs to elect young states' rights Virginian Robert M.T. Hunter, every Northern Whig acquiesced, and Hunter scored a 3-vote majority on the 11th ballot. Even Whigs who self-identified as abolitionists, like Ohio's Joshua Giddings and Vermont's William Slade, voted for Hunter when their party's interests so demanded. Yet in observing the election's disappointing conclusion, political abolitionists like Leavitt further envisioned constructing an analogous, single-minded anti-slavery bloc that could similarly wield a decisive balance of power. Quoting Leavitt, "Now there are in the House as many abolitionists as state rights men. Had they been only as much opposed to slavery as they are true to their party, they might with ease have secured the election of a man unstained at least with the open crime of slaveholding, and thus have broken up, probably forever, one of the prerogatives of the slave power, that of appointing all of the presiding officers of our national legislature." The ensuing congressional session's debates, conducted amidst the pressures of an upcoming presidential campaign, further persuaded abolitionists that to pursue their goals, they must stand outside the existing party system. The House passed a new, more stringent gag rule in January of 1840. And while anti-slavery Whigs fought boldly, if unsuccessfully, to defeat this new gag, they again demonstrated that their partisanship trumped anti-slavery convictions. William Slade's 5.5-hour plea for immediate abolition at the Capitol concluded by exhorting anti-slavery Whigs to cast presidential ballots for Virginia-born anti-abolitionist Whig William Henry Harrison. And abolitionists lauded Slade for having attacked the monster slavery and demonstrating that its influence in our country was all-powerful, but bemoaned that Slade lays abolitionism out of the question in electoral politics, even though he seemed to be quite conscious of Harrison's deadly hostility to the principles of liberty. Harrison's candidacy and the 1840 presidential campaign persuaded a growing number of anti-slavery activists that they must withdraw from the major parties. While the founding of an abolitionist political organization is sometimes mischaracterized as motivated primarily by anxieties over the taint of participating in a corrupt partisan process, political abolitionists' decision to erect a new party resulted as much from tactical considerations as from moralistic commodorism. The question of independent anti-slavery nominations could be viewed, political abolitionists explained openly, as a mere question of expediency as much as one of personal morality. For most political abolitionists, the move into third-party politics represented a practical response to overwhelming evidence that the Whig and Democratic parties would never meaningfully challenge slavery. As both major parties depended on Southern support, to be a partisan of either the Whig or Democratic ranks was, political abolitionists charged, to be ex officio pro-slavery. The call for an abolitionist presidential ticket thus grew naturally out of the conclusion that the slave power that controls the office of the presidency controls likewise the nation. The president, political abolitionists observed, represented the very incarnation of the party that supports him, and each new president's politics became, for the time being, the politics of the nation. Emphasizing Whig and Democratic complicity in slaveholders' dominance of the national government, spokesmen for the new Abolitionist Liberty Party advocated third-party voting as the only feasible electoral strategy for advancing a national anti-slavery policy agenda, even after the disastrous 1840 campaign, in which abolitionist James Birney won less than half of 1% of the national total, while Harrison carried nearly every northern state. Until the slave power was routed from control of national politics, Northerners of whatever political persuasion could never expect honest, democratically responsive government. Philadelphia Liberty man Samuel Hastings thus expounded, "It matters not what professions of love to the slave a man may make. If he is elected as a party man, he must do the work of the party first. If they require him to vote for a slaveholder for speaker, or to vote for a slaveholder for president, or in 1,000 other ways to sustain the slave power, he must do it." The Liberty Party offered the only option that would allow abolitionists to concentrate our votes upon candidates that it will not be necessary to question. With the Whig Party harboring more anti-slavery sympathizers and sometimes attempting to pass itself off as a true Liberty Party, political abolitionists especially challenged ostensibly anti-slavery Whigs, assailing the anticipated 1844 nomination of Kentucky Whig Henry Clay as the most compelling evidence of Northern Whigs' submission to Southern dictation. As a perceived moderate, who nonetheless owned dozens of slaves and scathingly denounced abolitionist agitation, Clay struck Liberty partisans as the most dangerous man in the nation, as no other politician could so effectually persuade the people of the free states to compromise conscience and liberty on the altar of expediency. While Liberty men acknowledged the sincere anti-slavery feeling among many Northern Whigs, that sentiment was swallowed up by a devotion to Clay and is thus made to uphold and strengthen the reign of the slave power. Thus, Liberty men especially castigated Northern Whig leaders who provided indispensable anti-slavery cover for Henry Clay and the slave power. For example, when Connecticut Whigs nominated abolitionist attorney Roger Baldwin for governor, a man with whom Leavitt had collaborated to free the illegally enslaved Amistad Africans a few years earlier, Leavitt charged that the Whig State Convention's simultaneous endorsement of Clay for president confirmed that Mr. Baldwin's known opposition to slavery, his spotless morals, and his faithful professional services in the Amistad case are held up by the Whig Party to attract a certain class of voters who could otherwise not now be induced to vote for a slaveholder. After years of Liberty attacks on Clay as the symbol of the Whig Party's pro-slavery proclivities, it should have come as little surprise that Liberty leaders balked when Northern Whigs attempted to wheedle anti-slavery voters into supporting Clay as a lesser of evils in the 1844 presidential contest. To Liberty men, Northern Whigs' proposal to elect a slaveholder in hopes of blocking slavery's expansion seemed like setting the wolf to guard the sheep. When Democrat James Polk narrowly defeated Clay and incited war with Mexico, a broad cross-section of Northern congressmen began to pronounce increasingly combative attacks on the slave power that sounded much like those Liberty men had been articulating for years. And these came through most thoroughly in heated clashes over the Wilmot Proviso's demand that slavery be barred from all newly acquired federal territory. Anti-slavery and anti-slave power sentiments quickly came to infuse the rhetoric of Northern congressmen, so much so that a Virginia congressman fumed in early 1847 that the U.S. House had been rendered a magnificent abolition society. As debates over the slave power proliferated, political abolitionists embraced new opportunities to build more extensive, if more moderate, coalitions that could place politicians independent of the slave power, first in Congress and later in the White House. Through decades of agitation, political abolitionists understood their efforts to quote Leavitt again, dethrone the inexorable slave power, initially as Liberty men, and later as free soilers, and finally as Republicans, as the crucial first step towards extirpating American slavery. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, first of all, to James Oakes and John Stauffer for organizing this wonderful conference. It's good to see friends, family, colleagues, mentors, and students. I see you, Curtis. Thanks for coming, everyone. The title of my paper is Like the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, Salmon P. Chase and the meaning of the anti-slavery platform. It's often forgotten, until recently, that is, that the Liberty, Free Soil, and Republican parties all endorsed the same basic platform regarding slavery. The core of that platform was a program known as Denationalization, or divorce. That program demanded a complete separation of slavery from the federal government. Quite literally, a denationalization of slavery. This meant, among other things, abolishing slavery in federal jurisdictions like Washington, D.C. and the federal territories. It also meant preventing new slave states from joining the Union and changing the general orientation of federal policy so that it favored freedom and discouraged slavery. The idea here was to withdraw federal support for slavery and circumscribe the South with a chain of free states and territories, to isolate the slave economy and force the Southern states into abolishing slavery on their own. The striking thing about this program, at least from a modern perspective, is that it did not call for direct federal action against slavery in the states. In other words, it respected the premise that slavery was a state institution which only the states had the power to abolish. Yet the proponents of denationalization were confident that, if enacted, the program would bring about universal abolition in the United States. Its chief architect, Salmon P. Chase, had, quote, no doubt at all as to the constitutional power of the general government to effect directly and indirectly the extinction of slavery. Ere long, Chase wrote, slavery will be driven back within her legal limits. There I trust, like the veiled prophet of Khorasan, to be stripped of her silver veil, to be exposed in all her monstrous deformity, and to perish amid the execrations of those whom she has so long deluded and betrayed. This seems like wishful thinking, and in many ways it was. Slavery as an institution was far more resilient than activists like Chase assumed, something the Civil War would make very clear later on. But plenty of people in the 1840s and 50s believed that denationalization would force the Southern states to abolish slavery on their own, and quickly. Pro- and anti-slavery groups differed on almost every point about slavery and federal power, but they were agreed on this, that slavery could not survive a withdrawal of federal support. To understand why they thought this, we must place denationalization into its 19th century context, viewing it against the backdrop of contemporary assumptions about slavery, property, and federal power. Though it did not call for direct federal interference in the states, denationalization was an aggressive policy for achieving universal abolition. There were two basic aspects to Chase's denationalization program. The first was to withdraw federal support for slavery in all areas under the direct jurisdiction of Congress. The second strategy was to have the free states of the North reduce their relations to slavery, interpreting their constitutional obligations as strictly as possible, always favoring freedom. Now, withdrawing federal support for slavery meant a number of things. Above all, it meant repealing slave codes in Washington, D.C. and the federal territories, and even in federal forts, arsenals, and post offices inside the slave states. It also meant preventing new slave states from joining the Union, a policy that would reduce the power of slave owners in Congress by guaranteeing a plurality of free states. Beyond these measures, withdrawing federal support meant prohibiting the use of slaves on federal public works projects and discontinuing the policy of seeking compensation for slaves lost in wars and in accidents and rebellions on the high seas. In short, it meant that every department of the federal government would treat slavery as a local institution whose protection was a state, not a federal, concern. Slaves would be considered persons at the national level. Only in the states would they be considered property. Withdrawing free state support could take many forms, but two strategies prevailed. The first was for northern courts and legislatures to deny slave owners the right to hold slaves within their limits. That is, to emphatically reject the idea that owning slaves numbered among the privileges and immunities of American citizenship. The second was for state courts and legislatures to adopt a narrow interpretation of the fugitive slave law, the federal fugitive slave law, which in practice meant minimizing the role state officers played in the recapture of alleged fugitives. Legislatures in the free states could also enact personal liberty laws, providing runaways with access to basic rights like habeas corpus and jury trial. Beyond these two strategies, free states could also repeal laws beneficial to slave owners from the so-called stay laws, again, laws which allowed slave owners to hold slaves in a free state for up to 9 months, to laws complementing the fugitive slave law. Last but not least, free state legislatures could repeal race-prejudiced laws on the grounds that they imitated the presumption of slavery in southern states. In this way, the free states could join the federal government in establishing an anti-slavery legal regime based on the presumption that all persons, regardless of skin color, were free. Together, they could jumpstart the process of state-by-state abolition, which had begun in the North in the late 18th century, but which had ground to a halt after 1804. Denationalization makes more sense when we consider that by the 1830s, slavery had, as some of our earlier panelists had shown, had become a de facto national institution. Congress had renewed slave codes in Washington, D.C., and recognized those in the Louisiana and Florida territories. U.S. diplomats sought compensation for slaves lost or emancipated on the high seas. Federal authorities hired slaves to work on public works projects, and the U.S. Army, let's not forget, removed Indian tribes from the Old Southwest, opening up huge tracts of land for slave owners. But even free state policies like providing comedy to slave owners and having state officers execute fugitive remands reinforced the general idea that slavery had become a national institution. Denationalization was about resisting that trend. It aimed to localize slavery by beating it back into the states where it already existed and revoking the federal patronage that allowed those states to postpone abolition. The denationalization program involved a series of 19th century assumptions about slavery and federal power. The first was that slavery was inherently weak and that its existence depended on the artificial support provided it by the federal government. In expanding the frontiers of the slave economy and protecting slave property in areas outside the slave states, the federal government had ensured that the continued viability of slavery in the Union. But deprived of that support, so the argument went, slavery would quickly wither away and die. This strand of anti-slavery logic shows up most clearly in the case for blocking slavery's westward expansion, that is, into the territories, which, by the way, was just one aspect of the denationalization program. Time and again, Chase and others claimed that prohibiting slavery in the federal territories would increase the pressure on the slave states themselves. It was widely believed that slavery depended on access to new land. For one thing, cotton depleted soil so quickly and thoroughly that new land was always needed to maintain output. But more importantly, expansion determined the value of slave property. The economic appeal of slavery was in the master's ownership of his slaves' bodies, not just their labor power. This gave masters the singular advantage of quickly transporting their entire labor force to fertile new lands in the American West, using that slave property as collateral for obtaining loans. So if Congress prohibited slavery's expansion, so the reasoning went, slave owners would find themselves trapped in the states with their investments mired in useless land and a rapidly depreciating population of bound laborers. A second assumption was that slave prices would drop precipitously once denationalization took place. It would subvert and delegitimize slavery not only in the border South, where hostile free state policies would inject fatal volatility into regional slave markets, but eventually everywhere in the South, as doubt and instability spread from the margins of the slave economy to its vital core, the Deep South. Not only that, but free soil islands, not just Washington, D.C., but the hundreds of federal forts, arsenals, and post offices inside the South itself would serve as magnets for runaways, while a presumption of freedom in federal areas would tempt slaves to challenge their legal status in federal courts. The coastwise slave trade, the main artery of the internal slave trade, would no longer have the implicit backing of the federal government, making it very difficult for slave owners to retrieve slaves who emancipated themselves on the high seas. All of this, according to the logic of denationalization, would undermine the value of slave property and leave the slave states little choice but to abolish slavery on their own. Surrounded on all sides with little prospect of maintaining parity in Congress, slave owners would find it neither profitable nor desirable to buy, sell, or work human property. Many of them would respond by voluntarily emancipating their slaves, but more importantly, Southern legislatures would begin the process of abolishing slavery voluntarily, recommencing the process of state-by-state abolition begun in the North. Salmon Chase, not only the architect of denationalization, but the person most responsible for its inclusion in the Free Soil and Republican Party platforms, based his program on the primary strand of anti-slavery constitutionalism. He argued that slavery was a state institution with no connection whatsoever to the federal government. In other words, Congress had no power to uphold or protect slavery in areas under its direct jurisdiction. This was a clever reversal of the so-called federal consensus, the premise, usually associated with states' rights slave owners, that Congress could not, under any circumstances, touch slavery in the states. This was a mainstay of pro-slavery constitutionalism, and it was generally respected in the North, even among abolitionists. The ingenious trick of anti-slavery constitutionalism was to turn that premise inside out. If Congress had no power to regulate or abolish slavery in the states, as slave owners were so quick to point out, then it was also true that it had no power to establish, maintain, or protect slavery outside of those states. Political abolitionists like Salmon Chase had developed this logic over the course of their debates with pro-slavery leaders like John C. Calhoun. In arguing about slavery's constitutional status in places like Washington, D.C., and in U.S. coastal waters, pro-slavery leaders had basically admitted that slavery itself depended on federal support, and that withdrawing that support would constitute a direct attack on slavery in the states. In other words, that there would be little difference between indirect and direct action against slavery. Calhoun and others had also revealed the extent to which pro-slavery thinking depended on a loose construction of the Constitution, in particular on the idea that rights to slave property were national, that is, extraterritorial rights, guaranteed protection under the U.S. Constitution, a claim which in fact could not be found in the text itself. In developing their response, abolitionists like Chase insisted that the federal consensus be read strictly, that slavery was not a constitutionally guaranteed right, that it depended entirely on state laws. For Chase, the Constitution recognized slavery's existence in the states, but it did not bestow a national status on the institution. In fact, it recognized slaves only as persons, not as property, which they could only be under state law. Chase and others backed this up with narrow interpretations of the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause, which prohibited Congress from depriving persons of their liberty, and the 10th Amendment's Enumerated Powers Clause, by which all powers not expressly granted to the federal government were reserved to the states. We usually associate these arguments with pro-slavery leaders like Calhoun, but they were also the foundation of the anti-slavery platform. In this sense, Chase's recognition of the federal consensus of exclusive state control over slavery was not a compromise with evil, but a deliberate strategy to strengthen the case for divorce, to trap slave owners in their own constitutional logic. In substance, denationalization was the same legislative agenda abolitionists had been pushing since the early 1830s. Chase, however, adapted that agenda to the realm of party politics, streamlining what had been a discrete set of initiatives into a straightforward policy prescription, divorce. And whereas abolitionists openly promoted universal abolition, Chase insisted that the sole objective of anti-slavery politics was to divorce slavery from the federal government. Nothing more, nothing less. Insofar as political parties used votes to repeal laws and reorient federal policy, Chase argued, their objectives were limited by the terms of the federal consensus. Northern votes could not reach slavery in southern states. Parties were more directly inhibited by the federal consensus than abolition societies like the American Anti-Slavery Society, which had no direct impact on the making and unmaking of laws, and thus had every right to pursue universal abolition. Anti-slavery parties, according to Chase, could not, at least not officially. Now, none of this means that Chase and his allies abandoned the cause of universal abolition. In 1842, Chase told a fellow Liberty Party leader that while the party's main objective was to denationalize slavery, it would also seek to, quote, establish liberty, to secure to each man the fullest exercise of all his faculties and powers, end quote. In this sense, Chase's recognition of the federal consensus was no craven arrangement with the slave power. It was a calculated move aimed at solidifying the anti-slavery platform and increasing its appeal among voters, North and South. Thank you.
Well, as each of my colleagues was rising and thanking everyone, I kept thinking in moments of terror, what if I forget? So I extend the blanket thanks and also hope that you'll extend immunity to any future speaker who may forget to do so. We're all very thankful to be here, and I think it's been a great conference so far. My remarks this morning are really to deal with the question of where Garrisonians in the American Anti-Slavery Society fit within this larger story of anti-slavery politics and the anti-slavery platform that Joe and Corey have already laid out. And on the one hand, they clearly are part of the same story. Garrisonians denounced the slave power as much as any political abolitionist. The Declaration of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, as several have pointed out, more or less accepted the federal consensus that Joe's just discussed. But on the other hand, after 1840, a series of schisms within the abolitionist movement propelled political abolitionists like Chase and Leavitt out of the American Anti-Slavery Society and into third-party political movements like the Liberty Party, the Free Soilers, and the Republicans. Meanwhile, Garrisonians who remained in the American Anti-Slavery Society adopted policies that seemed to push them farther and farther outside the mainstream of anti-slavery politics. Consider, for example, a notorious resolution passed by the Society in May of 1844, which resolved that secession from the present United States government is the duty of every abolitionist, since no one can take office or throw a vote for another to hold office under the United States Constitution without violating his anti-slavery principles. That resolution summarizes the Garrisonians' two most controversial policies. So let's look more closely at what they meant by secession from the present U.S. government. They meant, first of all, the individual refusal of abolitionists to vote or hold office, because to do so required swearing an oath to support a constitution that Garrisonians believed was pro-slavery. In 1854, of course, Garrison famously burned a copy of the Constitution at a 4th of July meeting in Massachusetts, which was an act that in some ways extended logically from this resolution 10 years before. But in calling for secession, Garrisonians were also calling for disunion, the term by which their platform is better known. Beginning in 1844, the Society adopted no union with slaveholders as its official rallying cry, and they called on the North to demand that slaveholders either abolish slavery or face the consequences of disunion. So if we return to the question, where do Garrisonians fit in the political anti-slavery movement with those views in mind, it's easy to conclude that the answer is not well, or maybe even not at all. Political abolitionists believed it was possible to act against slavery under the Constitution. Garrisonians did not. Political abolitionists believed that they could vote and run for office. Garrisonians did not. Political abolitionists sought ways of ending slavery without ending the Union. Garrisonians seem to have invited secession, almost gleefully at times. These contrasts are some of the reasons why many recent historians continue to see the Garrisonians as self-righteous separatists who adopted, quote, a remarkably passive plan of action, to quote Jim Oakes from several books ago. I don't know if he'd stand by that today. But both Jim and other historians have said that Garrison essentially led his small band of followers into a seemingly endless pursuit of self-purification, that he and his disciples privileged purification over the practical result of abolition. Others have viewed Garrisonian insistence on a pro-slavery constitution, in particular, as a dogma that rendered disunionists catatonic or even conservative in ways that ultimately served the interests of the slave power. Now, these are not new views. In fact, Garrisonians faced the same charges from political abolitionists at the time. The Garrisonian Samuel May Jr. remembered attending a Massachusetts anti-slavery meeting in 1846 when a political abolitionist rose to charge Garrisonians, quote, with backing out, and threw out sundry sneers about non-resistance and come-outerism, and told how those who took the side of the question which I have maintained sat still and sucked their thumbs. Now, it wouldn't surprise you, I hope, to know that I disagree with those characterizations of Garrison's disunionist movement. I don't think that they were thumb-sucking bystanders to the anti-slavery political movement. And in particular, I think that that depiction rests on three shaky assumptions that don't always hold up under closer scrutiny. The first assumption is that Garrisonians refused to vote solely for reasons of moral self-purification or theological beliefs, to keep themselves clean from the stain of politics. But in fact, as other historians have shown, they had a variety of reasons for remaining outside the political process, including the fact that many of the most active Garrisonians could not legally vote because they were women or because they were not white. Garrisonian men who refused to vote did so partly in continued solidarity with abolitionist women, whose active leadership role in the American anti-slavery society was one of the other reasons why political abolitionists and evangelicals bolted the group in 1840. So I think we do need to remember that by theorizing and defending a non-voting posture, Garrisonians staked out grounds for anti-slavery activism on which disfranchised citizens and non-citizens could also stand. The second assumption I challenge is that Garrisonian disunionism stemmed most of all from the religious come-outer views represented by non-resistance, the term that I mentioned earlier. And here I would just say that Garrisonians themselves vehemently rejected this charge. As Wendell Phillips put it, just because a man thinks the federal government bad, it did not follow that he thought all government so. And Garrison also insisted on the same distinction between disunionism and non-resistance, which was this sort of radical brand of Christian pacifism that verged on anarchism. But Garrison insisted these were two distinct platforms. And if we look more closely at the 1844 resolution, we can see why. First of all, it called not for secession from all government, as the most radical non-resistance did, but secession from the present United States government. And second, it grounded Garrisonians' refusals to vote not on a belief that all politics were hopelessly corrupt and sinful, but rather on the narrower belief that voting under the United States Constitution would violate specifically anti-slavery, not non-resistance principles. But perhaps the strongest reason, I think, for rejecting the idea that disunionism was a form of anarchism is the fact that Garrisonians often spoke as if actual disunion would never actually be necessary and was not, in fact, their goal. As early as 1846, Garrison said that disunion probably would never occur because slaveholders, quote, knew right well that the dissolution of the Union was the dissolution of slavery, as he put it. And before they would allow the North to actually leave, they would, quote, let their slaves go free as soon as they were convinced that disunion was a live possibility. I have little doubt, Garrison further declared in 1854, that if the North would only rise up as one man and declare that either slavery must be abolished or the Union dissolved, the South would emancipate her slaves from the instinct of self-preservation, conscious that she could not maintain an independent existence. As Garrison put it in 1854, were this to take place, quote, then we should be united indeed as a people, with one policy for all, with no conflicting interests, and with every root of bitterness removed. Statements like that, I think, show that behind Garrisonian disunionism was actually an intense hope that disunion would be averted by abolition. And these statements also undermine a third and final assumption that often governs historians' depictions of Garrisonians, that their disunionism was morally stringent, but not strategic, that it was a principle, but not an actual plan. And I believe that Garrisonians wouldn't have recognized this depiction of themselves either. I would argue that they actually believed, rightly or wrongly, that disunionism would have the practical result of ending slavery. As the Civil War began, Wendell Phillips emphasized that, quote, I have advocated disunion for 15 years because I thought it a practicable and peaceable method of freeing the North from the guilt of slavery. Usually we stop there. But he went on to say, and of planting at the South the seeds of early and entire emancipation. Now, this wasn't just a sort of about-face prompted by the beginning of the Civil War. Garrisonians made those statements consistently throughout the Antebellum period. Edmund Quincy, for example, declared in 1853 that, quote, I believe, and I presume the great mass of the people believe, and certainly the slaveholders believe, that as soon as that alternative abolition or disunion, is presented to the slaveholders, slavery will not exist for 6 months. Phillips also echoed those sentiments earlier in 1848. He said in The Liberator, "Our only object is the abolition of slavery." But dissolution would be very soon followed by that. This the wise and far-sighted Southerners know. Hence, such cling to the Union. The plan of the abolitionist was therefore to show slaveholders that the North was willing to abandon them to their fate. "Let us not any longer hold back the storm," declared Phillips, "the very fear of which will, we know, make the trembling master grant his victim a peaceful and bloodless emancipation." There, in a sentence, I think, is the disunionist plan, that slaveholders would enact emancipation because of fear of the specter of the dissolution of the Union. Now, if you think about it, it's a plan that, again, to come back to the denationalization platform, shares some striking similarities with what political abolitionists were saying. It, for example, agreed that slavery depended for its survival on national support that, if withdrawn, would spell slavery's doom. Disunionists even spoke as though emancipation would begin at the South. Edmund Quincy in 1853 even said, with his tongue only slightly in cheek, that if the South was convinced of disunion, South Carolina would be the first to act in emancipating its slaves. And that shows that the Garrisonians also believed that this emancipation would proceed by a state-by-state abolition. Now, there were differences, of course. One difference is that Garrisonians emphasized slave violence and the prospect of slave violence if the Union were ended. They called particular attention to the Constitution's provisions that the federal government would assist in putting down domestic slave insurrections. And so often these appeals to disunion were also attempts to conjure up images of the Haitian Revolution and slave rebellion, of what would happen if slaveholders did not free their slaves. As soon as the slaveholders saw that the physical support of the North would be removed, predicted Quincy, they would submit because the hands of their slaves would then be at their throats. And a second difference between the Garrisonians and the denationalizers is that they believed that the legal denationalization of slavery, as Joe has laid it out, that alone would not set in motion the events that political abolitionists hoped would occur. Remember that Garrison said only if the North stood up as a man, as one man, would Southerners be convinced that disunion was a real possibility, that if checked from expansion into the territories or from particular kinds of federal patronage, that alone would not frighten them enough to emancipate their slaves. Professor Oakes has pointed out, for example, that the denationalization platform often conjured this image of a scorpion stinging itself when surrounded by a ring of fire. And that was actually an image that was broached by Garrisonians in 1847 at a meeting of the Massachusetts Antislavery Society. But it's telling that for Garrisonians, the ring of fire was not a cordon of free states. It was a cordon of public opinion, a ring of fire that surrounded slaveholders with an absolute refusal to have any communion with slavery. They believed that if Southerners were convinced of that, then they would free their slaves. Now, is that wishful thinking? You know, Joe raised the question. And certainly I think it's wishful thinking in some of the same ways that political abolitionists thought wishfully. But I do think that it was based in some ways on an analysis of the slave power every bit as rigorous as that of political abolitionists. When Garrisonians reflected on the sort of swaggering slave power that had gone from strength to strength since the formation of the Union, they were convinced that, you know, as fearful as slaveholders might be of rebellion or disunion, they feared very little else. And Phillips, in fact, asked rhetorically in 1854, when has the South ever failed? When in any crusade has she ever been beaten? It's for that reason that Garrisonians stressed that they had to generate a united sectional anti-slavery Northern public opinion, that only that would spark a rapid Southern emancipation. In conclusion, I think if we think about disunionism in this way, as a plan, rather than just as a principle, I believe that several otherwise puzzling things about the Garrisonians become easier to understand. We can better understand, for example, why they were actually encouraged by the formation of the Republican Party and the Free Soil Party, why they ultimately joined the Union when the Civil War began. And most of all, I think we can better understand why the Garrisonians continued so diligently for over 30 years to speak and lecture and publish newspapers and do all of the things they did. I mean, whatever else we can say about the Garrisonians, I think we should agree that they did not sit still. They were very active, and I'll give two examples. One is that they sent lecturers from their societies out into the field, often into the districts of political abolitionists who were seeking election or re-election to try to stir up public opinion. Another example of sort of a very archetypical Garrisonian activity were the anti-slavery fairs that were hosted by abolitionist women every year, and in some cases more than once a year, from Ohio to Massachusetts throughout the antebellum period, where free produced goods and also anti-slavery pamphlets and material culture would be sold to passersby in search of a Christmas gift in Boston. And often, people would come into the fair, would be treated as well to a speech by John P. Hale or a political abolitionist who would be invited by women like Maria Weston Chapman to speak at these fairs. I think that, it's sort of implausible on its face to explain all of that activity as motivated by a bleak hopelessness about the North or the prospect of political change. They persisted in those activities because they thought that this and this only, cultivating Northern public opinion for disunion or abolition, would work. Wendell Phillips, I think, summarized best the disunionists' posture towards the denationalizers of the anti-slavery platform in his response to Charles Sumner's signature speech, Freedom, National, Slavery, Sectional, which laid out the theories behind denationalization that Salmon P. Chase had elucidated. Phillips agreed with Sumner, as he put it, that, quote, "When slavery is banished from our national jurisdiction, it will be a momentous gain, a vast stride. But to stop where Sumner did," Phillips added, "would, quote, mistake the halfway house for the end of the journey." That metaphor simultaneously distinguished disunionism from the Freedom National strategy and acknowledged that Garrisonians and anti-slavery politicians were on the same half-completed journey. Phillips understood that the differences separating disunionists from free soilers like Sumner had more to do with differences in strategic political thinking, with planning, than with the come-outer religious views embraced by some Garrisonians. For Garrisonian disunionists, the politics of denationalization was a halfway house, not because it was politics, but because they believed it would not, by itself, end slavery. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you talk about the contrast between disunion and, this is for the whole panel, disunion and the Northern secessionists who wanted to go ahead and secede from the Union, and as far as kind of using like a blockade of the South to do disunion, was that foreseen that the South then may secede from the Union, and that you'd have, instead of the North seceding from the Union, you'd have the South seceding from the Union of these slaveholding states?
Thank you. Well, I think that this is actually a question that I've pondered before, is how much disunionists foresaw what actually did end up happening, right, with the South seceding. A lot of the disunionist platform was built on statements by Southerners themselves, who in, bullying Northern politicians for concessions and national protection, would often say forthrightly, on the floor of Congress, we need national protection in order to preserve our property rights. And disunionists, to some extent, either rhetorically or sincerely, took those statements, at face value, that Southerners believed they needed the Union, would not leave the Union, and I think it was sincerely believed to some extent. If you look at the Garrisonian statements immediately after Lincoln's election and South Carolina's secession, a lot of them at that moment were still continuing to say we need to hold the disunionist line because they believed that this was another bluff, a comparable to the Compromise of 1850 or the Missouri Compromise, that they wouldn't actually leave, because they were just trying to make it seem real enough that they'd leave so that they'd get another concession, another compromise, that would protect slavery. So I think they did believe that. Garrison often said, he famously referred to the Constitution as an agreement with death, an agreement with hell and a covenant with death. But when asked why he became a Unionist after the war, he would often say he never expected to live to see death and hell secede, right? To some extent that was maybe a rhetorical justification, but and that's the way that others have seen it, that this is a sort of about-face. But I think it's consistent with this longer plan that disunionists were advocating, that if abolition was ultimately the goal of disunion, that once they saw, and often they referred to the beginning of the war, what was encouraging to them about it was not necessarily what Republicans were saying, because often they were still very critical, about the Republicans and their, not advanced enough positions on slavery. What encouraged them was that there was a united North. And that's what their entire program had sort of assumed needed to happen, was a united North that would brook no compromise and would leave before they would stay in a union with slaveholders. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's what I would say.
This is a question for the whole panel. One of the things that's always been very confusing to me about the Liberty Party's position on Freedom National is, how did they imagine that even a Northern-dominated Congress or a Liberty Party-dominated Congress, even if they had the presidency, would be able to circumvent the Senate, and in addition, the indoctrinated clauses within the Constitution that required the federal government to protect slavery in the ways that it did. The expansion into the territories makes sense. Abolition within Washington, D.C. makes sense. But you mentioned that federal forts would become islands within which fugitive slaves could flee. I don't understand how that could function under the Constitution as it stood. I mean, Garrison's critique of the Constitution in that way is perfectly salient. I mean, the federal government has to return that property, even if it is specifically mandated within those states. It's not as if the federal government at that point would become England, where you step on a federal territory. It required the passage of Military Powers Act for that to happen.
Thank you. Let's be clear that there's a lot of naivete in the denationalization program, but as I try to say towards the end of my paper, there's certain strands of logic that Chase in particular draws on to make his case about the consequences of denationalization. Well, Corey's paper shows that you're right, that structurally it would be very difficult to enact this entire program, right? But we should keep in mind that the Liberty Party always saw itself as a kind of balance of power political party, that it could copy or mimic the example of the slave power. Here's another example of how the conflict between the two sides draws out lessons. They would, in other words, do exactly what the slave power did, but in as you put it in your book's title, act as a liberty power, right? And win concessions one by one in Congress to abolish slavery first and foremost in Washington, D.C. There was a priority. The federal forts and arsenals thing, that was never dominant in the denationalization program. Washington, D.C. was. U.S. coastal waters also. The other thing that's also that's naive but significant in Chase's reasoning is his belief that there are potential allies in the South, not slave owners per se, but the many, many, many Southerners who don't own slaves, and who would be interested in a platform of states' rights, strict construction, free labor, free trade, things like that. So he always sort of counted on free white Southerners, a majority, to carry out these programs. It's, yes, in hindsight, naive, as Caleb's paper tremendously shows, but that's how generally he thought of these things.
I think I would say, and Corey has brought this out too, that the Liberty Party also was a tool for agitation. I think that has to be kept in our accounts of the Liberty Party, that it's not just a program of policies, but it was an attempt to get the North united, generate public opinion against slavery. So there's more commonalities, I guess, between the two.
And I'd just add one thing to what Joe said, whereas the idea of a Northern-dominated party like the Republican Party seizing control of the federal government would lead to a policy program oriented towards cordoning off the South. Also, alongside that, there was the idea that it would lead to political action that would make slavery weaker, especially in those upper South states where the vast majority of voters were non-slaveholders. So if there was Republican federal patronage being exercised in some of these upper South states, it might provide the basis for the development of an indigenous Republican Party in these states. And it was that sort of logic that terrified Southerners so much when Republicans began endorsing the Southern version of anti-slavery propagated by Hinton Helper's, or actually by the abridged version of Hinton Helper's Compendium of the Impending Crisis in 1859.
Mr. Brooks discussed the growth of third parties that expanded after the Mexican-American War. I was wondering what was the role of a Northern big business in the expansion of those parties? I know you need a cadre of activists, but you also need somebody footing the bill. And I know that there were many famous cases where there were Northern cities that were economically attached to the South, like New York, where there was a big pro-Democrat movement. I was wondering if that was a reverse, where there were also Northern big business that's needed some type of sort of organized political opposition to things like Southern opposition to the Homestead Act and things like that. So when we talk about the expansion of these third parties, is there a balance between how much it was basically the creation of on-the-ground activists or sympathetic members of the business community? Did that play a role at all in the growth of the Republican Party?
So to vastly overgeneralize, in 1848, I think the Free Soil Party tends to do poorly in the areas that we would associate with big business, Manhattan, Philadelphia, manufacturing, Whig-controlled manufacturing towns in parts of New England. But where economic interest does ultimately play into the Republican Party is in an alliance between workers and manufacturers who are interested in tariff protection and sort of forward-looking agriculturalists in the North who are interested in government programs like the Homestead Act or the land-grant college proposal that would facilitate the improvement of Northern agriculture, especially in the states that were interested in modern scientific agriculture that would allow them to compete with more fertile Western lands. And the work, well, the dissertation, I guess, right now, of Ariel Rohn, who's currently at Yale, is really excellent on this, on the role of agricultural improvement as sort of an economic basis for the Republican Party. I'm much more focused clearly on these political anti-slavery arguments, but the fact that this plays a role, this economic component plays a role ultimately in the success of the Republicans, helps sort of maybe explain what the Liberty Party and the Free Soilers were missing, and that Whigs like Joshua Giddings and William Slade had a point when they imagined that a victorious Northern Party needed to be both anti-slavery and suggest why attacking slavery would be beneficial to the economic interests of many Northern voters. But the Liberty Party guys were right that that was impossible as long as you had a party that was reliant on Southern votes to win national elections.
So I love the way these three papers come together, and maybe I'm just sort of misinterpreting it, but I'm envisioning this moment in 1860, 1861 in which the nationalists and the disunionists can both point to a moment of victory, can basically both look and say the process that we are hoping to initiate is beginning to play out. And if Stanley Harold is correct, we have the defection of the border states from the Confederacy sort of as the beginning of that sort of state emancipation. And looking at it from the perspective that you guys are setting up, I could foresee this conversation between the two factions, which looks something like, let's just wait and see how this plays out. But of course, that's not what happens. What happens is that the nationalists launch a war, and as far as we can tell, the disunionists tuck in with a gusto. So there's something discordant there, and I wondered if you could talk about it.
Well, I think one thing that I guess these papers didn't bring out as much, but I think is an important part of all of these groups' platforms, is the idea of military emancipation. And so, as at the moment at which it's possible to seize on those powers of military emancipation, they point to that and articulate that as a reason for joining the Union cause. In a roundabout way, I think the disunionists' support for the war, even though it's been seen as the most surprising because of their historical pacifism and non-resistance, is less surprising given their oft-stated beliefs about how hard it would be to get the South to relinquish slavery. But you're right that this is, it is perplexing for some of the people on both sides. I've talked about the Garrisonians as a united group, but of course there were people within the American Anti-Slavery Society who actually were advocating, we should just stand back and let things play out. I believe that, even though they were a very vocal minority and therefore have gotten a lot of attention, that they were a minority within the Anti-Slavery Society, but certainly within these networks of correspondence between American abolitionists and particularly their British allies, who I've talked a lot about. Their British allies were especially kind of perplexed by why the Garrisonians were suddenly unionists. I don't know if you guys want to.
Yeah, to echo on Caleb's point, I think that in 1861, Republicans, Chase in particular, saw this as maybe just another bluff, another one of these moments, and that it's important to keep in mind that from the beginning of Chase's denationalization program and of anti-slavery politics, there had always been an assumption that they would never leave. That is, the southern states would never leave, right? Because the other option would be so terrible. That is what in James Oakes' work is described as the European way, right? Meaning French style or Haitian military emancipation, as you were saying. So that was always the background assumption. And so people like Chase, I think, assume that they don't want to go there, and that denationalization is a far more safe and, as you can see, rational system for ending slavery. So I don't think that, I think that assumption, that background assumption about military emancipation was always on the table, but they just didn't expect it to happen. So wait and see was their policy.
I mean, it's also worth noting, and this is sort of a commonplace, but is true, that Republicans from Lincoln to Chase believed that secession was unconstitutional. And there was sort of no question, if you read the correspondence of the most radical Republicans, that if the South didn't come back into the Union voluntarily, it would have to be forced back into the Union. I mean, there's at no point where Chase or Sumner or the notable radical Republicans are squeamish in the winter of 1861 about the possibility of war. It's just not crossing their mind to just let the South secede and see how things go for a few years.
I have a question for the panel, kind of inspired by something that Joe said, but if anyone has an answer, I'd be very interested. I just wanted to bring kind of the other recent big slavery debate about slavery and capitalism, Ed Baptist's new book, but particularly with the loans and the mortgages and the financial products created and backed by slavery. I was just wondering, were these abolitionists, political, Garrisonian, whatever, were they completely aware of this? And did it play into the ideology or political program in any way?
By this, again, could you elaborate?
Just the centrality of slavery, especially financial products, mortgages, loans, the kind of way that capital was go on into the South,
Yes.
loans to buy slaves.
Okay, yeah.
And also how it reverberated in the national economy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, denationalization is based on a political concept of property as a state thing, not a national thing, and that's crucial. But as you may have been able to tell from the paper, there is this kind of rationale based on the political economy as it was understood at the time of slavery, that the value of slave property was based not so much in the labor of the slave, but in the ability of the master to pick up slaves and go out west as fast as possible, something that a northern factory owner cannot do. This is like Gavin Wright's work on the economics of slavery. So that kind of thinking about slavery as an economic institution, as a modern component of American capitalism, played into their thinking about how to contain it, right? Like all markets, if you contain it, you really do damage to it. And if it can't expand to new markets, or if it's pieces of it are destroyed, such as in Washington, D.C. or something like that, you do a lot of damage to the slave economy itself, right? And once that motor starts buckling and shutting down.
I would say, sort of going back to the response to the previous question about why Garrisonians believed slavery would be so hard to uproot in the South, I think they were aware, especially by the late Antebellum period, of how much economic power slavery had. I mean, Phillips would often say that, to expect that an aristocracy with $200 million, and they often, the kind of James Huston point about the just value of slaves as economic assets, that they wouldn't give that up, without a fight. I think there was a kind of a maturing recognition of that by the outbreak of the war, on the part of Garrisonians. So.
And let's not forget that there were a whole host of northern anti-slavery arguments about how slavery was detrimental to the national economy, and also that there are arguments about how it drained capital from the northern economy. These are probably wrong as economic analyses in many cases, but it was an issue they were grappling with, and it was something that they attended to politically. But the economic issue was always sort of secondary in my mind to some of the political and moral issues for the more radical political abolitionists that we're discussing, that Joe and I are discussing here.
I think it'd be a good idea to do the same and ask all three questions and then see where they are and if there's overlap. So if you'd like to ask yours.
Excuse me, my question actually had some overlap with the two previous questions, and you addressed it fairly well, so I'll just, about economic connections and the economic dimensions, I'll just address this specifically to Joe. To what extent did Chase's program, denationalization, rely on the idea, since you mentioned Gavin Wright, that slavery was economically inefficient? And I guess another way of asking it would be, to what extent did they elaborate a free labor argument as well as a free soil argument?
Brilliant, thank you.
So I just noticed that a common theme between all these papers seems to be this perceived weakness of slavery, and that was a big folly among a lot of these northern organizations. And so I was wondering, to get that big of a misperception, were there any other factors besides this constant Southern propaganda, or maybe they didn't realize it was propaganda, that they wouldn't be able to survive without the federal government, that fed into this perceived weakness of slavery that made so many of these organizations a bit arrogant about it?
I'd like to know why they would continue to assume the South would never leave the Union when some Southern leadership had been threatening secession since the Missouri crisis, and they seemed to hold the simultaneous idea that slavery was extremely economically powerful and the slave power had political control in the South, so why would they think the South would never leave the Union when they'd been doing those things?
I think maybe in response to those last two questions, I think this is where it's important to underline one of the differences I was suggesting between Garrisonians and political abolitionists about stressing slave insurrection and the possibility of the violence of the enslaved if the Union was withdrawn. So, I mean, slavery was weak, but it wasn't so much that it was it was weak because it was threatened by this kind of ongoing internal war between masters and slaves, that it wasn't just going to die off or wither away on its own. It was going to take force to uproot it. And so that's why they believed that whatever they said, whatever Southerners said about leaving the Union, that they depended on the protection of the federal military. And so that all of that was kind of smoke and mirrors, but they wouldn't, when push came to shove, be able to exist as an independent. And in some ways, they were right? I mean, in some ways, now that we're kind of understanding the Confederacy as Stephanie McCurry does, as kind of a doomed project, from the beginning, there is some justice to that analysis, I think. So.
I wanted to address first Sean Griffin's question about the free labor component. We're up here talking a lot about property and personhood, but we haven't been talking about free labor that much. So just very briefly, I want to say that as John Blanton was talking about in the very first paper today, self-ownership is a property concept, and it's also crucial to the free labor concept. The fact that you own yourself, you own your labor, you allocate your time, your body, your everything. Is self-owned, right? And I just want to emphasize that when we talk about property, it's important to talk about the economic side and American property law, but that property also is political in the sense of self-ownership, right? That's the crucial flip side of the coin, if you will, to the free labor and component of the free soil thing. The other thing about the weakness, the assumption in denationalization about the weakness of slavery has to do with the nature of slave property, that unlike a chair or a horse, we all know that slaves can run away, they can cajole, they can trick. Human property is just fundamentally different than other forms of property. And so creating these kinds of free soil or Somerset lines in the American federal system creates an instability in which human property can run away, can make decisions that they couldn't have made before. It changes the terms of the debate. So I just want to emphasize that about the weakness of slavery.
And it is worth noting that the two sources of greatest political controversy in the decade or decades even leading up of national political controversy in the decades leading up to the Civil War were, of course, Southern slaveholders' access to federal territories and Southern slaveholders' ability to count on the rendition of fugitive slaves who escaped the slave states. And both of those things would have been effectively impossible if the South left the Union. So the things that the South were, at least on the face of it, immediately asking for, they would lose access to should they leave the Union, which perhaps affected the miscalculation, if we might see it that way, of some of the anti-slavery Northerners. And on the perceived weakness of slavery, I would just add that political abolitionists were pretty consistent in arguing that part of what gave slavery, right, an institution from which only a very, very small fraction of white Americans directly benefited at any one time, directly as slave owners. Part of what gave it so much strength was that slaveholders controlled the federal government for almost the entirety of its existence, in large part, political abolitionists argued, through their ability to control the major parties that were in power. And so if that were to be reversed, slavery could potentially genuinely be threatened.
Thank you, and we'll reconvene at 1:30 again, and thank you to...